Hello, I'm Amanda Moore. I'm the Director of the Clearinghouse Community. Welcome to the Advocacy Exchange for November 2018. Both the Advocacy Exchange and the Clearinghouse Community are brought to you by the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, a national leader in advancing justice and opportunity. Today I have with me two guests, and I will introduce them to you in turn. First is Sharon Dietrich. Sharon is the Litigation Director at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and she's joining us today from Philly. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks for having me.
Glad you're here. And second is Rebecca Vallas. Rebecca is the Vice President of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress. And Rebecca joins us today from Washington, D.C. Hi, Rebecca.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Glad you are here too. So Sharon and Rebecca wrote the advocacy story that's currently on the Clearinghouse Community. It is called The Left, the Right, and the Football Players, How Clean Slate Automated Sealing Was Passed in Pennsylvania. And you can find that on the Clearinghouse. It's at povertylaw.org/clearinghouse. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about exactly how the left, the right, and the football players came together in Pennsylvania to pass this innovative new automated sealing law. But before we get started, I want to let you know how you can be part of our conversation. Most of you are watching this as a live stream on the Shriver Center's YouTube channel, and you'll notice that to the right of your screen, if you're on a desktop, or you can pull up from the bottom if you're on mobile, there's a live chat box. You can send us your questions or comments while we're talking there. We would love to hear from you. Let us know what you're seeing in your state or what questions you have about what happened in Pennsylvania. You can go ahead and test that out now. I see a few of you had done that. You've let us know your name and where you're watching. We've got Dorinda in Minneapolis and Leslie in Pelham, Georgia. Thank you all for going ahead and saying hello. The rest of you can try it out as well. You can just send us your name and where you're watching. If live chat is not your thing, that is okay. You can still get in touch with us by sending me an email. I'm at Amanda Moore, Moore, at povertylaw.org. And I'll be checking my messages while we're talking, so feel free to contact us that way. Everyone who registered for today's webcast will receive a follow-up email probably early next week. That email will contain a link to a recording of today's program, as well as a link to Sharon and Rebecca's piece. It will also contain a link to register for next month's Advocacy Exchange, so keep checking your email for that next week. All right, Sharon, I want to start with you for just the overview. Let's make sure that we all understand what this law is and why it's unique. So can you give us a brief summary of Clean Slate?
Sure. So what is innovative and different about Clean Slate is that for the first time, criminal record cases will be sealed by automation, by which we mean rather than people filing individual petitions saying, I would like my case to be sealed, computer query will be run by our state administrative office of courts and by our state police that basically recognizes that these cases are eligible for sealing and seals them automatically without that individual needing to do anything. We designed our particular statute in a way that other states might consider narrow. So just to give you the criteria, essentially we're sealing non-convictions, what we call summary offenses in Pennsylvania, which are below misdemeanors, and many misdemeanors that are nonviolent and at least 10 years old by this automated process. So the numbers are staggering, and what we think is most innovative about this is that this is a way for us to address what's come to be known as the clean slate gap, the difference between the number of people that are eligible to seal their records and the numbers that are actually getting that remedy. So the early returns show that literally millions of criminal cases in Pennsylvania will be sealed by this method without any action at all by the person who wants their case sealed. And while we were at it, we also used the opportunity to expand our criteria for sealing so that more misdemeanor convictions can be sealed. In fact, we're very excited that the day after Christmas, for the first time, people convicted of simple assault in Pennsylvania will be eligible to get their cases sealed, since violent cases have often been a bugaboo with our legislature. So those are primarily what our Clean Slate law will do here in Pennsylvania.
Great. Thank you for that summary. Rebecca, I want to turn to you and ask you about the origin of this idea. How did this begin, the idea of the automated record clearing?
So it's great to be here and hanging out with the clearinghouse community today, not just because I love legal aid lawyers, but because I used to be one. And I often refer to myself as a recovering legal aid lawyer, though I don't know that I'm recovering very well, as people who know me will know to be the case. And so going back to my time in legal aid, when I actually worked for Sharon, I remember seeing from a firsthand perspective just how much a criminal record can really be a life sentence to poverty and to joblessness. Somebody can have an old record, decades old, a misdemeanor record, even an arrest that never led to a conviction, and that can haunt them like a scarlet A for the rest of their lives in ways that have all kinds of negative consequences, not just for the individuals who have the records, but also for their families and their kids and for entire communities. And so when I came to the Center for American Progress back in 2014, after my time at Community Legal Services, and came here to start working out on our poverty agenda, I hung out with Sharon, as anyone who is smart and wants to do good work would be wise to do, and do as often as possible. And one night we were hanging out, kind of banging our heads against the wall, saying, man, we know how problematic criminal records are for so many people. And at this point, 1 in 3 Americans now has some type of criminal record. So it's this huge epidemic. And yet we also know how under-resourced legal aid is to handle these cases, and how rare it is for people to be able to afford to secure a lawyer that requires paying a lawyer if they can't get help from legal aid, to try to navigate these processes of petitioning the court to get their records expunged or sealed or cleared otherwise. And so as we were talking about how could we possibly bring the remedy of record clearing to scale in a way that closes that second chance gap that Sharon was talking about before, we started to think about how, technology may have in a lot of ways caused this problem, because it's the digital era where 9 in 10 employers are using some kind of background check, 4 in 5 landlords. It's all because of these records being available technologically. Maybe technology could also be part of the solution here, and we could think about a way to automate clearing of records once someone has proven their rehabilitation by remaining crime-free for a certain period of time. And that was really how the idea of Clean Slate was born, was thinking about how we could put technology to use as a solution to close that second chance gap. And I have to say, just one other piece to add to this, in the time since, that anecdotal sense that I had, that Sharon had, that many of you watching I'm sure see every day, of how few people are actually able to successfully access remedies like expungement and sealing, we've now started to see researchers putting numbers to this. And so, for example, in Michigan, researchers at the University of Michigan have started to uncover that it's less than 5% of folks in that state eligible to have their records cleared are successfully getting them cleared. That's a mind-blowing figure when you think about the scale of the problem, and how now also researchers are telling us that tens of millions of Americans nationwide may be eligible to have their records cleared, and yet this really tiny share are actually successfully getting them cleared, when it's this one person against the system kind of approach that we currently have in states across the country. So that was the sort of backdrop behind the idea of saying, let's make record clearing automatic where we possibly can. And that was how Clean Slate was born.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a really interesting history. I want to stay with you, Rebecca, to talk about past the birth of the idea and into actually getting this to happen. One of the really interesting pieces of this story is how it wasn't even just bipartisan. It was, multi-partisan or transpartisan. It just really crossed all sorts of political divides. Can you tell us a little bit about, in Pennsylvania, who the groups were that were involved and how they were able to find common ground on this idea of clean slate?
The first thing I'll say is that never in our wildest dreams did I think we expect an idea that we first put out into the world back in 2014 in a report that CAP joined forces with Community Legal Services to publish called One Strike and You're Out. Never in a million years did we dream that an idea put forth then was going to become law in as soon as just 4 years. And it did in Pennsylvania, as Sharon said, earlier this year. And that wasn't, I think, that wasn't the result of a traditional advocacy. It was, I think, what made this idea and the sort of strange bedfellows coalition that has cropped up around it. It was the weirdness of the bedfellows that really allowed it to be something that took off so quickly and became law so fast. So we saw, for example, directly affected folks. One of the chief spokespeople over the period of the campaign was actually one of Sharon's former clients, a friend of ours named Ronald Lewis, who himself has a 15-year-old record that is misdemeanor, and it continues to haunt him to this day and stand in the way of all kinds of opportunities. So we saw directly affected folks standing up and saying, this is important for me, but they were standing shoulder to shoulder with, say, chambers of commerce from across the state, as well as groups that, such as law enforcement, the district attorneys saying, you know what, this is actually not just something that's going to help people find jobs, and it's not just good for people because it's going to cut poverty. It's also something that's going to make our communities safer, because people aren't going to be trapped in cycles of recidivism when they don't have any better options. We saw a business I mentioned coming to the table, like the chambers, because they saw it as a workforce development thing, and it was something that was good for business for that reason. And a lot of businesses feeling like they're facing a skilled worker shortage, as they often put it. And so it was those types of groups coming together alongside political left and political right. I'll be honest, the Center for American Progress rarely teams up with, say, the Kochs or Freedom Works, or groups that we might not agree on much, if anything else. But we do agree on this. And I think it was that, in combination with the just phenomenal transpartisanship within the legislature, that made it possible. And I'll tell one quick story that I think helps showcase how weird the bedfellows were, not just outside as part of the coalition, but actually inside the political system in Pennsylvania. You had perhaps the most conservative member of the Pennsylvania Senate, Scott Wagner, someone who doesn't even believe there should be a minimum wage, taking this on as someone who would start almost every sentence with, as an employer, this is why I believe in Clean Slate. And he was teaming up with folks like Tony Williams from the Philadelphia caucus, and who had run for Philadelphia mayor previously and is seen as sort of a stalwart on these issues traditionally. And yet, at the same time, when Scott Wagner ultimately actually decided he was going to run for governor and challenge the sitting Democratic governor, you still had Tom Wolf, who was recently reelected as governor, liking this idea, even though it had been championed by his political opponent in the gubernatorial election. So really something that I think all sides have figured out is good for them in a whole range of different ways. And now we've started to see that materialize at the national level as well. I know we'll get into that as well.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple of questions come in. I want to stick just for a second with you all on just kind of the mechanics of this and the groups involved. Sharon, one of the unique pieces of this is that we had professional football players from the NFL involved. How did they get involved, and do you think that their participation really, oh, forgive me, did they really move the ball on this? You can groan, it's okay.
Pun noted. I really am not sure this bill would have passed without them, because we got through the Senate quite easily, and then when we got to the House side, the committee chair in Judiciary was not necessarily opposed to the bill, but wasn't particularly interested in the bill. And at the same time, as everyone knows, the NFL players, many of them, were exercising their rights to protest before games and were becoming politically active. And in Philadelphia, we had Malcolm Jenkins, who remains one of the on-the-field leaders for the Philadelphia Eagles, as well as becoming the co-founder of something called the Players Coalition. So Malcolm was standing up for racial justice issues And the question was, what kind of policy program did he want to put behind that? And we convinced him that Clean Slate would be a good program for them to support. And so the day after a Monday night game, 3 players, Malcolm, Torrey Smith, and Chris Long, got on the train and went to Harrisburg and spoke to the legislature in a press conference on the Capitol steps about why this bill was important. And Torrey, in particular, who is now a wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers, and I say that only because there are NFL players everywhere who may be interested in supporting this kind of initiative. Torrey told the story about how his mother had a record from when she got into trouble with her abuser, and how having a felony record with the head of household affected his entire family while he was growing up. They were very poor. And somewhere along the line, his mother got a pardon from the governor of Maryland. And after that, her income shot up to a 6-figure income. So it was a very compelling personal story that people heard, I think, in a different way because it was coming from a celebrity. And so suddenly our bill had visibility that we could have never developed on our own. And in fact, I remember looking at my phone and checking sports scores on ESPN.com, and there was a story about my bill at the top of my newsfeed. So at that point, the House Judiciary Committee and the House leaders overall got really interested in the bill. And I'm not sure, I mean, maybe the bill would have passed without them, but I know that their involvement and the visibility that they brought was very helpful.
Wonderful. So I mentioned we've had a couple of questions come in. Interestingly, they're both from Michigan, and they both have kind of a state-specific question. We'll take Andrea's first. Andrea is in Flint. She wondered if there is a site for the study you referenced about Michigan's 5%. So you may not have that handy now, but I want to flag that for you all, Sharon and Rebecca. If you do know it, go ahead, Rebecca.
Answer for you, because to try to make this easy for folks who want to learn more about Clean Slate, but also want all of the resources and the tools and the data, you can go to cleanslatecampaign.org. And what I would urge you to do is to look for the toolkit. It's hard to miss because it's sort of flashing at you in a lot of different spots, but download the toolkit, and there are sites to the Michigan statistic I mentioned about the second chance gap there, as well as a whole bunch of other kinds of research that can be really helpful to help people understand why Clean Slate automated record clearing is something that makes sense for as many states as end up taking it up.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'll note that I mentioned everyone will receive a follow-up email early next week. We'll include that link that Rebecca had, so you'll have it handy. But just to repeat, it was cleanslatecampaign.org, and look for the toolkit. And that may also help answer Kelly's question. Kelly also wrote in from Michigan and said, after she read about Massachusetts automatically sealing records years ago, she's been preaching about this idea of automatic sealing. She wants to know about partners who are in Michigan, maybe working on this. So what we can do, Kelly, is afterward, I could put you in touch probably with Andrea as well in Flint, since there seems to be some interest there, and with Rebecca and Sharon, so we can get some of these parties talking to each other, which is exactly why we have the Advocacy Exchange. She also asked a question about the difference between Massachusetts and Pennsylvania's record clearing. I don't know if that's something you all are familiar with Massachusetts. If not, maybe that's something that we can put you in touch with someone afterward. Sharon or Rebecca, do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what they're referring to, what's being referred to in Massachusetts, but Massachusetts does not have the same vehicle that Pennsylvania is getting ready to implement, where it's done by technology and where the scale is substantially bigger, I think, just because hundreds of thousands, if not millions of cases can be sealed without anything having to be done, no data input, just run a computer query.
The one other thing I would add is that it's really great to hear so much interest in this this hangout from Michigan, because Michigan is actually one of the states that is positioning itself to be on the heels of Pennsylvania's bill becoming law, one of the sort of campaigns coming out of the gate for 2019 state legislative session. So really timely to be hearing from you guys, and we'd love to put you in touch with the folks who are leading that campaign work right now in Michigan.
Great, and we'll do that as soon as we can after today's webcast. This just brings me to another question, Rebecca. I'll stay with you. It sounds like we do have viewers who are thinking about this and what they can do in their states. What do you recommend that people do? Obviously, there's the cleanslatecampaign.org and the toolkit. What other steps would you recommend for people who are considering looking into the possibility of clean slate in their states?
So I'll tag team this one with Sharon, because I know she's got some to say here as well. So part of the reason I'm pushing that website is because it's not just a website with a bunch of resources. It's actually the hub for a national campaign, a bipartisan campaign, that the Center for American Progress and Community Legal Services were really proud to join forces with about 30 groups across the whole range of the political spectrum, as well as a whole range of funders, all to support work in the states to bring clean slate legislation up and hopefully get it over the finish line. And so, as I mentioned, Michigan is one of those states. There's a whole range of states now exploring whether clean slate makes sense in their states and whether this is something that they want to be taking up next year. And that was what was behind actually that website and all of the materials on it, was building out national campaign infrastructure so that folks on the ground in your states, if you're looking to connect with other partners, maybe across the aisle, maybe folks you don't work with on anything else or even agree with on anything else, we're in a position to try to help and to connect folks with these kinds of strange bedfellows to replicate the success in Pennsylvania. So a lot that we're able to do to connect people with the folks who are eager to be jumping in and supporting this state work. Sharon, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to some of the questions people should be asking themselves about Clean Slate and whether it makes sense for their states.
Sure. Let me, or Amanda, did you want to go in a different direction?
No, that's important.
Okay. I think there are at least two critical things if you're interested in Clean Slate to scope out. The first is what environment in your state? I wish I could say that all 50 states are equally able to implement this law, but unfortunately, that's not so. The states that will most easily be able to implement this law, and in fact, some states may not be feasible if they don't have this. You need unified court system data, because what you probably can't do is queries in each of, say, 30 different counties or 60 different counties. You need unified court data where all the counties are providing their data to a centralized office, administrative office of courts, usually. That's not a hard and fast rule, but it's mostly the case. Because if the data becomes too truncated, this methodology just doesn't work. And of course, we'd be happy to talk with you more about what the scary sounding thing means. But I just wanted to highlight that the technology in your state is a necessary place to begin to figure out whether this might be a campaign you can really run and succeed at. The second thing that I would mention is that the scope of the bills in each state are going to vary, and advocates are going to figure out what they think the bill for their state would best look like. So I don't think Pennsylvania's bill is the bill that many other states would do. Quite honestly, Pennsylvania does not have strong expungement and sealing law compared to a lot of other states. We don't seal felonies. You may decide that felonies in your state ought to be sealed. You may decide that rather than doing sealing, which is usually understood to mean keeping the records but suppressing them for certain uses, that expungement is right in your state. You may have different time periods than what Pennsylvania has chosen. It's the methodology that matters when you undergo a campaign like this, not the specifics of Pennsylvania statutes. So just think of it as a model to be used to design what proposal is appropriate for your state.
Thank you, Sharon. I'll stay with you, Sharon, to talk a little bit more about this tech piece. So the automation piece of the new Clean Slate law in Pennsylvania is scheduled to go into effect in June. I wonder if you could talk a little about the plan for implementation and if you and the other parties that were involved in passing the law will continue to be involved in the implementation phase.
We are. In fact, all of my time pretty much these days is spent on implementation of Clean Slate in Pennsylvania.
Thank you for that, Sharon.
You're welcome, Rebecca. So for instance, Clean Slate is only as good as the data that is in the system. If data is not there, you can't use it to run a query. So in Philadelphia in particular, many cases do not have grades of the offenses. And our query, based on what is sealable under Pennsylvania state law, requires the grade of offenses to be known. So we're actually looking at ways that we can backfill data into the database, which would be good for the whole system anyway, but really will make so many more cases clean slateable, as we now call it as a verb. Also, the issue of court fines and costs. Our legislature wrote the bill to say that if you owe court fines and costs, they're not going to seal your case. Now, again, this would not have to be your bill, but this is our bill. This is our law. So we are looking at ways to potentially, for instance, have the city write off a lot of old court debt as a way of making many thousands of cases clean slateable, which currently are not. So we passed something that's terrific. And if we did nothing else, still hundreds of thousands, if not millions of cases will be automatically sealed. But we want it all. So we're trying to figure out ways in which we can get more tens of percentage points of cases sealed. For instance, I think currently our number that we think we can hit just with misdemeanors is that 18% of all convictions in Pennsylvania can be clean slated into non-existence as things currently stand. But we can get that number substantially higher if we deal with some of these other issues, and we're trying hard to do that.
Thank you, Sharon. Our time is drawing to a close, so if you have a question for Sharon and Rebecca, please go ahead and send that through the live chat or email me at amandamoore, MOORE, @povertylaw.org. Rebecca, in our few remaining minutes, I want to turn to you. Sharon, you mentioned earlier, I believe, when talking about the football player involvement, that there was a racial justice angle to that because they had become involved with the NFL's involvement in Black Lives Matter and other race equity movements. Rebecca, I'll turn to you to ask you, was there an express racial justice angle to this advocacy for Clean Slate?
Absolutely. And we've talked a lot about it in terms of poverty and as part of an anti-poverty strategy, but the racial justice implications are ones that we would be remiss not to mention, and they're absolutely core to this work. So folks, I'm sure who are participating in this hangout today know very well all of the statistics of the disproportionate impact that our broken criminal justice system has had on communities of color over the past several decades. And that's true not just when it comes to mass incarceration, that's true when it comes to over-criminalization. A lot of folks end up being arrested, and maybe that never even leads to a conviction, but they can still have that arrest record, as I mentioned before, hanging over them. And so one number that knocks me out of my chair almost every time I hear it is that almost half of Black men and 44% of Latino men are going to be arrested by the time that they reach age 23. Just let that sink in for a second. So here we are at a point of about a third of our adult population in this country having some type of a record, and that's got far-reaching tentacles into pretty much every community in this country. But the impacts are felt deepest, without question, in communities of color. And so one of the major drivers of disparate unemployment rates and of disparate poverty rates and disparate economic hardship rates among communities of color really is shutting people with records out of the labor market. And that's what policies like Clean Slate, by taking this kind of relief to scale, have a real opportunity to do, is not just to dramatically reduce poverty in this country, not just to dramatically improve economic opportunity for huge numbers of folks, but also to take a huge bite out of racial inequality. And that's part of what we're really excited about when it comes to the potential for this law to now spread to other states in various versions across the country.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for tuning in today. And I want to remind you that you can read Sharon and Rebecca's advocacy story, The Left, the Right, and the Football Players, How Clean Slate Automated Sealing Was Passed in Pennsylvania, at povertylaw.org/clearinghouse. And if you like today's program, please join our mailing list at connect.povertylaw.org/clearinghouse. I'll remind you that the Advocacy Exchange is now available as a podcast. You can find it on iTunes, Google Play, or SoundCloud. And I'd like to invite you to join us for next month's Advocacy Exchange. It's time for our annual look at the last Supreme Court term and what it meant for our clients' ability to access the federal court system. My guests will be Jane Perkins, the Legal Director of the National Health Law Program, Gary Smith, the Executive Director of Legal Services of Northern California, and Mona Tawatau, the Senior Litigator at the Western Center on Law and Poverty. That will take place on Tuesday, December 11th, same time as today, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Pacific. And the link to register for that will be in the follow-up email that you will receive early next week. We hope that you will join us next month. And until then, remember that you aren't alone out there. Thank you.